Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual has popped up the past 24 or so hours. This is actually one of two videos which is going to be uploaded today because there is so much happening in the world of tech recently that a single video is just getting kind of unruly in terms of its length. So I decided instead just to start splitting them up. On quieter days it will be of course just one video, but today is definitely not a quiet day. We have a bunch of Zen 3/Milan stuff, and then we're going to move over to tons of Nvidia information, and then the second video will be focusing on release dates yet again of consoles and DirectX 12 Ultimate and some other stuff as well. But getting back to the focus of this video and AMD's Zen 3, which, as you are almost certainly aware by now, will launch later this year for desktop as part of the Ryzen 4000 series. There was a slide which AMD themselves plonked onto the internet as part of a kind of video discussion for Milan and what we would see for Zen 3, and one of the key takeaways of course was that we saw that the cache itself for the level 3 was unified. This is versus the two 16 megabyte level 3 chunks, and of course each of those was for each of the CCXs. So now the CCD is essentially unified, so you can kind of think of CCX and CCD as now the same thing, whereas previously it was like two CCXs huddled together lovingly in an embrace, which naturally had latency implications and stuff that we've talked about 1 billion times, so I won't go over again and again and again. But hardwarelux.de, I've had to use Google Translate because unfortunately I don't speak German, have actually received a bunch of internal slides. Unfortunately, they have been unable to publish those slides. If you're unfamiliar with how leaks kind of circulate on the internet, this is not surprising to me. I often get told information myself or shown a slide and then asked specifically not to publish it. This is particularly true if it's got watermarks on it, or if it's for internal uses. It's just way too easy to understand where a slide has come from. And also another reason that sometimes very specific things you can't mention, but other things you can, because it's possible that a very specific piece of information isn't so widely known, whereas other things have been distributed to more vendors, meaning it's harder to track down which vendor leaked what. But getting back to the topic itself, apparently the level 3 cache is not more than 32 megabytes. You can see the plus here, but there were rumours it could be higher. There were reports of 64, but a consistent one I saw was 48, I think it was, megabytes. I think I even reported it, but no, it's staying as just 32, which is still plenty, to be honest with you. The slides that they've received also confirms that the IPC performance is about 15% improved for the integer workloads. For EPYC processors with 32 cores, we can look at up to 20% performance increase over Rome, and this is primarily because of how the clock frequencies work. This, by the way, marries up perfectly with something that Jim over at Adored TV was kind of stating, and then later one of my exclusives as well, where I kind of added a little bit more to the performance data of Jim. And basically this information seems to be perfectly in line with that. In my info I also had the fact that we would see a Zen 3 refresh confirmed, which was my exclusive over Warhol, and I'm pretty damn positive that that's real. Subsequently we've seen future roadmaps as well leak with further information on that. And Warhol is basically Zen 3 refresh, but we don't know the specifics, what it means by refresh, because Zen to Zen Plus was technically a refresh, but then you could also look at, let's say for sake of argument, Coffee Lake is technically a refresh of sorts of Kaby Lake. Yes, I know there were slight changes, obviously they increased the number of cores, but you can argue it's basically a Skylake refresh. And you could also say that you're just cranking up the clock frequency. There's many different ways to interpret refresh, so we don't know what the performance numbers are. I'm hearing it's still the same core count, but I don't have a clue, honestly. Milan, though, seems to be focused primarily on individual core count performance. So basically, the performance of each core is the focus, rather than multi-thread performance. This matches up extraordinarily well with what you would also want for a gaming chip as well. Because obviously single thread, performance is of critical importance for gaming. Yes, I'm not saying games only take 2 CPU threads, but as we all know, one of the reasons Intel's been ahead is because Skylake against Zen 2 and especially Zen 1 did have that single thread performance advantage, thanks not least of which to the clock frequency. So AMD capitalizing on this and then basically giving Intel even less room to hide is going to be very interesting. This is, once again, integer performance, but even so, it's still extremely impressive. Especially given the clock frequency we've seen of engineering sample parts is about 4.9 gigahertz, assuming that does translate to final production silicon of Ryzen 4000. Yeah, I can see how. Well, my source originally told me that Milan was probably, for the engineering samples, was a couple of hundred megahertz faster than Rome, so that does, of course, also continue that information. We've also got a tiny bit of information about Genoa, but it's not a lot. They've basically said that there are more than 64 cores. Again, this matches up to some of my exclusive information that I've revealed in the past, that AMD were considering bumping the core count up for their SKUs, even on the desktop. The problem was that for the desktop segment, they were not settled on whether they would do it yet. It really depended heavily on Intel. But now Intel, of course, we're learning what they're doing with their future processors, with the big LITTLE design. Maybe AMD feel that they may do so for the Zen 4 focused CPUs, which obviously would come after the refresh of Zen 3. But for Genoa, it seems like we will see more than 64 cores. However, it will also continue SMT2. So we don't exactly know what this means, though, in terms of core count. There is no information. We don't know if it's only 64 cores or whether it goes to some number in between, let's say 96, or whether it's 128 or what. Another reason that AMD can do this is because of DDR5. Again, that's one of the reasons that AMD haven't been able to increase the core count over 16 for the current desktops. It's because essentially DDR4, it doesn't provide enough bandwidth. It doesn't matter how many cores you've got. If you can't provide them enough data, it doesn't really matter. Although, of course, a more robust caching system does help some. With Genoa, we're also seeing the switch from SP3 to SP5. And this will also mean that the TDP ranges, however, will still be identical. It seems like they will also be switching from PCIe 4 to 5. Again, logical, and additional bandwidth, of course, is extremely important when it comes to AMD's mission. I will link the Hardware Lux article again in the video description, so you can go ahead and check it out yourself. But I will be very interested to see how all of this plays out. Genoa will be on the 5nm process, whereas Milan is using an enhanced 7nm process. So I think we can probably agree that AMD's not resting on its laurels, it's not sitting on its butt. We know, of course, that Zen 4 is quite far along now in production. Zen 3 is basically having its engineering samples tested. These are physical samples, and I believe they've already gone out to certain partners. Zen 4 is being bought up, and I believe is being tested in the early silicon phase. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty damn sure I'm right. And Zen 5, to my understanding, is still pre-silicon, but it is still being bought up. I mean, AMD have confirmed it, but to my understanding, it's still not in actual physical form at this point. And I also am really excited because there's tons of information too about the RTX 30 series. And this is courtesy of videocards.com. Again, I will link Ycry's article in the video description. I won't go through all of the specs here because, well, I think some of it is kind of dry to talk about. And I also will point out that the RTX 30 still has quite a few question marks. But there are some things which raise my eyebrow. The one thing I would like to get off my chest first of all is it's mentioning second generation ray tracing cores. This again matches up with information that I'd reported a couple of times in the past. One was exclusive, one wasn't. That AMD were, Nvidia, not AMD, Nvidia were focused on improving ray tracing performance by not just essentially reusing the cores that were in Turing, but there were some fundamental shifts in the technology. It wasn't exactly clear though, and it still isn't, what the difference is. I mean, we can probably assume that it's just much more efficient and can handle way more intersections. Even assuming worst case scenario of a 50% improvement in ray tracing performance, that's one of the leaks that per RT core it's a 50% bump. I've heard much higher numbers. I've heard 100% and way higher, but let's just say at 50%. That does mean theoretically that a 3080 or a 3090 could well actually handle ray tracing at 4K for the vast majority of games. But there's also third generation tensor cores too, which naturally they are responsible for a plethora of things, not least of which is DLSS. The card also supports PCIe 4. This does bring a lot of questions to mind. What, for example, would be the performance degradation on PCIe 3.16? Or for that matter, what is the performance degradation even if you were to run a PCIe 3x8? Like, quite frequently, even on high-end cards, there's not that much of a difference from a PCIe 3.16 to a PCIe 3.8. There are some differences on on certain games, but quite frequently it's not really that big of a deal. But next generation stuff with so much texture swapping and just the raw amount of data that's going to be thrown backwards and forwards, maybe that there will be a bigger difference. If so, I'm going to be curious how this plays out, because it could be that a 10900K or whatever, even if you say that it has a gaming advantage over a 3950X, simply because of the reduction in bandwidth, because of obviously PCIe 3 versus 4, yeah, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. I'll be curious how all of that plays out. Getting back to the specifications though, the most obvious thing is that it states that it's a 7nm node, and Ycry is currently unable to confirm if this is true, but the data sheets that they've seen does indicate that it is 7nm. This flies in the face of all previous information that it was 8nm. We also don't know if it's Samsung, TSMC, or Bob down the road who's manufactured this. Yeah, I can't really say much more on that. I could spitball a whole bunch, but until there's clarification one way or the other, I'm just talking without really being able to say anything more than, potentials. And there's so much other stuff to talk about. Let's get on with that. The other thing is that the 3090 now is confirmed, obviously Nvidia still haven't stated it, to have 24 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory, and the 3080 has 10, and the 3070 has 8. Again, I'm hearing that there is a 20 gigabyte model for the 3080, but it's going to launch later. How much later? I have no idea. That does kind of irk me. I don't like that, because obviously if you want to buy a 3080 for higher resolutions, then that can be a bit frustrating, but maybe they're having issues procuring the higher capacity RAM. That could be a problem, especially as it's GDDR6X, so maybe they've had to use that for the 3090 production, which honestly would make sense. I still think 10 gigs is probably enough for now. One theory is that the 30 series does have better data compression, although again, I don't have solid information on that, so it's just a guess. The bandwidth, however, of these two GPUs, 760 for the 3080 compared to the 512 of the 3070, and finally the 3090 has 936. So the rumours were that it was going to ship with 21 Gbps, but later on there were some reports that this would not happen, and they said it could be only 19, so 19.5 does fit within that. The core clocks, we only have the boost frequencies here, which are basically 1700 megahertz for both. There's 15 megahertz advantage for the 3080. We don't know the 3070. Again, that falls roughly in line with what we've heard previously. I suspect that you will be able to crank these higher. I wouldn't be surprised if, honestly, they hit more like 1800, 1900 megahertz, which is pretty damn impressive, given the fact that there is 5248 or 4352 CUDA cores respectively. We don't know how many the 3070 has. The interesting thing, though, is that the TGP for these is 350 and 320 watts, with the 3070 only having 220. That's an awful lot of power consumption, but I honestly, I know this is very much down to user preference. I don't really care on the power consumption necessarily, as long as the cooler's quiet enough and the heat is under control. I know that some people really, really care about power consumption, and that's totally okay, and I get you. But yeah, I don't mind it too much. I mean, I had like the 290X and the 390 from AMD, which was obviously pretty power hungry, and I also had a GTX 480 as well, so I think that does kind of show you that I don't care so much about power consumption. I more care about if something sounds like a leaf blower. The rumour is that the 30 series won't sound like that. We've seen leaks now regarding the design. Long story short, though, I'm going to be really, really, really amped up for what we see with the next generation cards. I'm super excited. Same thing for AMD as well. I'm super excited for the next generation cards. It's not that, of course, Turing or RDNA 1 or whatever is bad now. It's just, with the next generation consoles coming out, hardware-based ray tracing becoming very prevalent in games over the next several months. And honestly, some games now, just 4K 60 FPS is not doable, even on an RTX 2080 Ti. So I'll be curious to see what the next gen brings us. With all of that said, though, thank you very much for watching the video. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.